corresponded across these ecological tiers. And so we can see here on the left, the first line of analysis that I did is I want to see how these rock art place types corresponded to each ecozone. And we can see in the Puna, we have a lower quantity of site, or a lower total, but a more even distribution. And then coming down to the agricultural tier in the Sunni on the left here, we can see that it's almost entirely pictograph sites. It evens out a little bit more in the Quechua, although not entirely. Likewise, with the feature relations of the rock art sites, I wanted to see what sort of feature types they were on and how that corresponded to the ecozone as well. And what I want to draw your attention to here on this side is the yellow bars that we can see in the Puna. We don't really have any associations with tombs or chulpas, but we really start seeing this starting to happen in the agricultural zone. So with that, I wanted to get some data on the iconography as well. So in the documentation phase, which ran concurrently to the survey phase, we went through, and to identify the rock art features, we wanted to not just identify the panels themselves, but their associated features, rock and cultural features with them, because this is really where the meaning comes into play and what makes it meaningful. So we flew a drone over these features, and this is the site of Kinyantanka here. And we can see it's a large boulder in the center top here, and the red square is where the petroglyph panel is located. And to the right here, we can see a carved stone canal where libations or offerings were poured that abutted the rock of the boulder of Kinyantanka and went into the Fortaleza River. And then with this data, we were able to make like these topographic maps and so forth, which were really useful, which allowed us to model the iconography with the landscape features. So at a more closer granular level, I also made these photogrammetric models of the panels themselves, and I used these as the base for making digital renderings of the icons and the symbols themselves. And so with that data, I then also wanted to take this imagery of the symbols and see how those corresponded across the ecozones as well. And we can see we have about 6 categories of image types here: anthropomorphs or human images, zoomorphs or animal images, geometrics, red stains, which don't have any figurative art like the one we see in the lower right-hand corner here, abstract images, and other. And again, we can see, looking at the histogram on the left side of the screen, focusing again on the yellow bars, we see where these red stains, they're almost non-existent in the highland Puna, but coming down to the agricultural tiers, we see a relatively high percentage of them down here. So this is interesting. And this is really what informed the excavation phase, what I'll get to in a moment. But just to synthesize all of this information really quickly, we can see in the Puna that we have a high percentage of petroglyphs and a high density of figurative art that is more associated with caves and also with springs, but also in very few places. So we have less places in total, but they're really, really packed with a lot of rock art. Coming down in the Sunni, it's almost entirely pictograph art and almost entirely red stains at that. And it's also associated with springs and agricultural fields, but now it's associated with funerary architecture or the chulpas. And lastly, in the Quechua, we can also see that we have a high percentage of pictographs, although with less red stains, also associated with springs and agricultural fields and chulpas, but with more figurative art than we found in the Sunni. So with this synthesis, this is what informed the excavations. And so I chose 4 sites. On the lower left here, we have the site of Payauta, which is our star on the left, and then 3 highland Puna rock shelters: Hatun Machai, Shaksha Machai right here, and lastly Diablo Retrato right here. Also, the community was completely, entirely involved through and through with these excavations. We had local archaeologists working with us, and we had local indigenous campesinos, as they're called, from the local communities that were helping out as well. Not so much with the excavation, but more with the screening and with observing and helping facilitate relations with the community and so forth. So this was another way to incorporate our work with the community and make it hopefully more meaningful with them. So turning our attention first to the site of Payauta here, we'll look at what Hernandez Principe had to say about this place. And he said it was approximately 1 league, or more or less 1 mile, from the town of Achoca, and is located at the pinnacle of a rocky mountain that is difficult to get to, and is associated with the Wadi Ayu, which went by the same name. Oh wow, well how neat. Well, we have a place called Payauta right by the Pueblo of Pampas Chico. And this is Payauta right here on the left. And the stars indicate, the star to the left here is this archway that leads up from here from the bottom up this pathway through an arch and leads to the top of this rock formation here that has a large defensible structure. And it has this pinnacle at the top that has a large gouge carved out of it, which is called the Inca Bath. Now the rock art panel for Payauta is right here in the red box, and it's overlooking these agricultural terraces here. Having a closer look at this rock art panel, I want to draw your attention to our circled image here. You guys might recall this from a previous slide. We have this double arc icon. This is what I interpret as being associated with the Payauta Aiju. And this is really beneficial, or really informative, these excavations, because we were able to find really not much of a diversity in lithics or ceramics or other cultural materials. So this tells us that we had a really relatively short occupation here. And this is also evidence in the rock art, because stylistically and in terms of the pigments and so forth, it really looks like it was more or less a short production episode. Our carbon samples more or less bring us to the date around AD 1200, as we can see in the upper right-hand corner here. So moving along to our highland Puna shelters, we really found more or less the same trends and tendencies in these shelters in all three of them, which was really, really good for me, actually. So it kind of simplified things. So we had our stratigraphic profiles of these rock shelters. And in the lower levels, we were finding a lot of these leaf-shaped points and some artistic features as well, like this pendant or amulet, which is associated with the Chavin period, more or less around 500 BC, give or take. But when we get into the higher cultural levels here, we start seeing these smooth slate points, slipware ceramics. And so we have this difference in material from the lower strata and the upper strata, but we also had tons and tons of faunal materials all throughout. So these caves were being used as hunting shelters and ceremonial shelters where animals were offered all throughout time, or all throughout our cultural periods at least. So I don't want to confuse you with this graph, but we'll see at the three squares on the right here, we have three main occupational phases on the FI from this excavation data. One at around 2500 BC, another one from 1500 to 200 BC, and then after a gap, another one from 600 AD to around 1400. Now on the right here, we see our two columns. One says pictographs, the other says petroglyphs. So for the pictographs, I identified 5 pictograph styles: Shaksha Machai 1 and 2, Inca Wakanka, the Fortaleza pictograph style, and the Hatun Machai pictograph style. And for the petroglyphs, I identified 3 traditions. One is the incising tradition, 1, 2, and 3, a possible 4th. I'm not sure if it exists or not. That's why it's in dots. And then we have a gouging tradition and an abrading tradition. So first, looking at these petroglyphs, just wanted to give you guys a look here at the superpositioning or the strata of the rock art motifs themselves. And this was kind of like my smoking gun. And this wasn't something that I really noticed until later, until I was really looking at the photogrammetric models, that I noticed this stratigraphy or superpositioning of these images. So we can see the various image types that we have here within our blue box here, which is highlighted on the right. We can see that we have these stick figures with these U-shaped arms and legs. And we can see that these stick figures are carved in a certain way, possibly using certain tools. But overlying that, we can see that the zoomorphic image is partially obliterating and is carved over the stick figure images. So we're starting to see a relative dating here, relative sequencing of these rock art image types. And lastly, we can see here that we have this really fine detailed anthropomorphic head image here that is covering the zoomorph image here. So I took this relative sequence from this stratigraphy, I paired that up with the ground stratigraphy, and that's how I was able to make the typology. So this right here is our incising tradition 1, 2, and 3. Okay, 1, the stick figures, 2, these zoomorphic figures, and 3, these anthropomorphic figures up here in terms of style. Now this box is in red because I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. These were followed by the gouging traditions, which I won't get into today, which have 2 types of gouged rock art we can see in the photo there. And lastly, we have the abrading tradition, where we have these superficially abraded bold images that are often put over or overlying other types of rock art. So turning to the pictographs here, we can start off with our Shaksha Machai style, which very much relates to, from an imagery standpoint, to our incised petroglyph art, and in many ways is contemporary to it as well. Looking to the right here, we have the Inca Huacanca style, which is contemporary to the incising style 1, and we see so obviously why, with these U-shaped arms and legs and stick figures and so forth. And then after a long gap, we have what's called the Fortaleza pictograph style during what is called the late intermediate period in the Andes. And this is from around the year 1000 to 1476 AD. And this is characterized by these very large red blobs and pictograph panels that are associated with these chulpa structures in mortuary architecture. And then lastly, we have our Hatun Machai pictograph, colonial pictograph style, which is obviously during the colonial period. And we can see this Christian iconography in the lower right-hand corner. So one of our case studies that we want to focus on here really deals with social emplacement during the late intermediate period. And so we're going to focus again on our double arced motif that we saw from Payauta. Now, if we map that across the FI, we can see that it occurs in about 10 different places across the Fortaleza ignimbrite. So what this tells me, and what my interpretation was, is that this was the distribution of the Payauta Ayu. And this would make perfect sense in an Andean context, because you see that's all on the north side of the Fortaleza River, and we have a fundamental distinction between right and left, or upper and lower. This is a dualistic structure in an Andean worldview. So it makes sense that one Ayu was on one side of the river. Looking in the red box on the other side of the river here, we're going to focus right here on a place called Pintai Machai, which is in the lower left-hand corner. Now, standing from Pintai Machai and looking over the Fortaleza Valley here, this is the view from Pintai Machai over the valley, we can see two other sites. One is SRF 21, which we have here. This was a sacked tomb. There are actually human remains in there still. So I have them covered up for sensitivity purposes. And also we have another site here called Kinyan Tanka as well. And so we see different imagery here, all right? We see the circle and dot motifs and other types of images. Now, are these the markings of the other Ayus of Cascaparak, of Wayaya, or Llanos? Possibly, but more research is needed for that. So our other little case study that we want to focus on here deals with petroglyph palimpsest during the formative period. And we're going to go back to the incising petroglyph tradition 1, 2, and 3 here. So petroglyph palimpsests are designed by singular and multiple palimpsests. Now, a singular palimpsest really consists of people going to the same place and putting a similar image type at that same place. Now, it's not really sure if these images really relate to each other or if they're in dialogue. Usually they're not. But if we start coming into incising period 2 here, we see these zoomorph images. They look like they're very much in conversation or in dialogue with these incising 1 images here. So we see these things starting to come together and create a narrative or a conversation with each other. And you can really see this clearly when we have all 3 styles together around 600 to 200 BC. And if we look at our inset photo in the upper right-hand corner, we can see that we have an incising 3 image that is carved next to an incising 2 image. So it looks like it's creating a head on top of a body. And this would really correspond with this idea, Andean concept of kamai, or this life force that really imbues everything. So things are becoming animated and the story is being developed through the development of these palimpsest petroglyphs at this site of Kinyan Tanka. So quickly, in the findings of this research, really we found linked symbols with named groups, which is a really rare thing to do in rock art research. So we were fortunate with that. With the typology, we found these diachronic changes in location, in imagery, and production techniques. And obviously we found rock art linked with these ancestrally venerated landscape features of Waka and Pacarina and so forth. So with the conclusions, we found that rock art really linked past people with critical landscape junctures and with their own histories. It influenced movement depending on the type of rock art. And rock art really was central. The rock art of the FI in all of its expressions was really central to instilling the Pacha worldview, as we can see. So with these findings and these conclusions, the next step was to follow up with these communities. And what I did was, on the left here, is I created these individual museographic installations that were displayed in grade schools and community centers and so forth. And these were really specific for each community, just to show the community what exactly was on their lands and their immediate lands surrounding their pueblos. I also went to the local university and communicated these results to archaeology students who often didn't have opportunities to reach these places, even though they're close by to them. So it was a really successful effort and endeavor to disseminate, not just garnering community support, but also really disseminating, working with these communities as well. So obviously, all this research wouldn't have been possible without the community support, without the funders, and without the university that I was working at the time. So this is where we pivot now. We seem to be doing pretty good on time. We have about 15 minutes left. So we're going to take all of this Andean landscape research and these Andean landscape concepts and try and apply them to landscape museum exhibition development in the Americas. Okay, so I came to the US again after my work in South America in 2017 when I accepted a position at LACMA as a postdoctoral fellow there. And I had a fairly difficult challenge of trying to take this Andean rock art research and make it somehow inform a museum exhibition, which was my assigned project as a postdoc there, at a museum that really doesn't have many Andean collections. And so I started thinking, well, maybe I could start doing something related to my prior NAGPRA work in the Southwest from the Field Museum. And so I proposed this project, a museum project that would focus on the bear's ears, which I'll explain what that is in a moment, to my boss, Diana Magaloni, in the Art of the Ancient Americas department at LACMA, and she thought it was a good idea, so I went forward with it. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with Bears Ear, what the Bears Ears National Monument is, it's a segment of land in southeastern Utah that was protected, the legislation was written in 2016 by President Obama to protect these lands as a national monument, and is loaded with all sorts of natural and cultural features. And it's a very important place for the 5 tribes of the Bears Ears Coalition, who are identified here with their symbols at the bottom. We have the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, the Ute Indian tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, and Zuni Pueblo. So these 5 tribes came together in an unprecedented agreement between themselves and with the federal government to have a joint land management strategy for the Bears Ears. And so I've been working with them since 2010 to create an exhibition about Bears Ears. And the working title that we have now is called Bears Ears Living Land. And for those of you that aren't familiar with this photo or what Bears Ears is, in the background here, this is the namesake for the monument, these 2 buttes, which are considered to be, in a Navajo legend, these are the ears of a bear which is partially buried into the ground. Okay, so that's where it gets its name. And so this is now a joint collaborative exhibition between LACMA, Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, and the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. So why Bears Ears? Why not any other place in North or South America to have this exhibition? Well, it's a good opportunity to talk about a land that is a very small but a very vital aspect of a much larger traditional cultural landscape, or TCL. They really communicate this point that this is really kind of just a small area, much like an Indian reservation, is a very small portion of these original traditional lands. Also, communicate the point that this is a plural and multivocal landscape. Really want to communicate to the audience that Native Americans are just not one people. It's very diverse perspectives that relate to a very similar land. It also has a lot of endangered resources, which I'll get to in the next slide. And therefore, it is a flashpoint for conservation and land management rights throughout the Americas. So it's very timely in that sense. And lastly, it's an opportunity to utilize collections to build relationships between museums, researchers, and tribes, advocate for protection, and also produce resources that are valuable and useful to our stakeholder communities, and really in the process to provide science education for our Los Angeles visitors. So for those of you guys that are familiar or not familiar with the boundaries of Bears Ears National Monument, we can see in the photo on the right here, our boundary in green was the original monument designation, but this was slashed in January of 2018 to the dark green spots that we can see within the map there, later done by the Trump administration. So this is really done so because there are a lot of mining interests in that area. So the Bears Ears region is a hotspot for uranium mining, and the largest uranium mill actually lies right outside the monument's boundaries. As we can see in the photo on the left here, all sorts of uranium mines send their waste to this mill that's right outside Bears Ears. And Bears Ears itself, as we can see in the photo in the center, has all sorts of uranium deposits that a lot of folks are really looking to explore and exploit. And finally, with our photo on the right, we have these tragic instances of vandalism, of rock art, architecture, and other things like other cultural features within the monument that need protection. So, getting into how this project started. This started when I started my postdoc appointment in late 2017, early 2018, when the monument was slashed from its original boundaries to its current boundaries right now. And so this is when I proposed the project to my boss, Dr. Magaloni. Fortunately, she thought it was a good idea and she encouraged me to go forward with it. So the first steps in this project is that I made multiple field trips in 2018 and 2019, and these were more individual conversations. And these were really built on the relationships that I had with the cultural leaders that I had developed through my prior work in NAGPRA at the Field Museum nearly a decade before. So fortunately, these talks went really well, and there seemed to be a lot of interest in doing a collaborative exhibition. But still, these conversations were really just between me and some of my friends, I suppose, who were cultural leaders. And we really needed to bring this more at the institutional and tribal levels so that the conversations can happen at that level. So we organized 2 meetings between the museums and the tribes, one in Utah in April of 2019, and then the big meeting in February of 2020 that we have in our photo here on the right. And so this is where we had all the tribes of the coalition itself, representatives from both museums at the same table to discuss the project and see if there's interest and to hammer a way forward. So in this meeting, we were able to establish the stakeholder goals. And this is really fundamentally important to this collaborative work. And really, we have 6 major points that we came away with by doing these interviews and these charts and so forth, and just identifying people's interests. One is to show really to the community, non-native community, museum visitors, what it means to live in a place and be connected to it from an indigenous standpoint. So not just be connected to it through its history, but really to be linked to the land from an ancestral standpoint. Also, we want the tribes to tell the stories from the first person, to have them tell their own stories, not to have a foreigner, an outsider, or someone like me telling someone's story for them. The idea is to give them a place and a platform so that they can tell their important stories. We want to promote the importance of the concept of traditional cultural knowledge and why it's needed and fundamentally necessary for the nourishment of the land and its conservation. We also want to create awareness to the threats of the Bears Ears, really through understanding in a museum exhibition. You guys may know that museum exhibitions really have a way of connecting and impacting people in a way that newspaper articles or videos can't do. So we found that a museum exhibition is really a dynamic way to really hammer these points home and connect and engage with people. We also want to generate resources that are designed to retain and transmit traditional cultural knowledge with the communities. So as we saw in Peru, a lot of this traditional cultural knowledge is leaving these communities. So we want to create resources so that younger generations can retain this knowledge. And obviously, through the process, we want to protect and respect the sovereignty of our partners, of our tribal partners. So this means don't be pushy, don't impose our desires or our beliefs about how or what this thing should be to them. This is their project, so we'll let them take the reins on it. We're here to offer guidance and opportunity. So with that being said, our exhibition overview, it will be at NHM. It is slated now for a 4,000 square foot gallery, and we'll have approximately 60 objects. And this will include textiles, ceramics, metalwork, stone carvings, and all different types of objects. We really want a dynamic appearance. These museum collections will be complemented with drone videos, AR and VR experiences, and interviews with cultural elders and cultural leaders that explain from a first-person standpoint in their own languages, as well as English and Spanish, how they relate specifically to the Bears Ears, to their general cultural landscapes, and also with specific features within the Bears Ears National Monument. So with this, our big idea of Bears Ears Living Land is that Bears Ears is a living land, as the title states. It's a place that contains and transmits the histories and memories of a diverse group of Native American peoples into which their identities are inextricably linked. And this concept applies to Native peoples of Southern California as well, where it will be displayed. And if this exhibition winds up traveling, which it may, this can also have more local perspective to where it will be displayed in the future. So this is the big general idea of this exhibition. Now, when I was first designing this exhibition, I was really struggling on how I was going to really organize it. And for months, almost a year actually, I was really struggling. I had this idea that I wanted to have an introduction, and then each tribe would tell its own story about the land. But I never really liked that. It just seemed really sort of fragmented and segmented and siloed. So I started applying these Andean concepts of Pacarina, emergence, Machai, and these of Waka, and these ancestral elements, which actually were informed by my prior NAGPRA research. And I came up with a set of unified themes that really apply to all of these tribes and create a more unified presentation of the general narrative. So starting off with the introduction, we want to introduce the audience to what the Bears Ears is. And we want them to know that it's a place in Southeast Utah. It has a lot of cultural and natural resources that are endangered. It has a lot of diverse indigenous perspectives. We want them to know that it's a small but vital part of a traditional cultural landscape. And we also want to communicate that this was a landmark management strategy between the tribes of the coalition and the federal government. And that's why it is important from a political standpoint as well. So getting into our more thematic issues or galleries of the exhibition, we start off with the narratives of emergence and migration into this world. And this is informed by this concept of Pacarina. And we want visitors to understand that the Bears Ears is central to the historical narratives of the coalition, BEITC, and tribes' emergence into this world and their journeys to where they reside today. And this relationship is unique for each of the tribes. And so these stories can be communicated through this vessel, through symbolic means, like this swirling motif, which identifies emergence into the world and migrations. Also, migrations are communicated with our Zuni stone carvings that we have here on the lower left. Each of these stone carvings corresponds to one of the clan groups in the Zuni tribe and their ancestral migrations through the land. This migration can also be communicated through our Ute moccasins in the upper right-hand corner, or perhaps a virtual reality experience with a rock art panel like the one we have here of the Hopi panel of Tutuveni outside of the Hopi Mesas, where the clan groups through time left their clan symbols on a specific rock. Moving along, we're going to move into this idea of embodiment and animation. This gets back into the idea of Waka or Kamai, the life force through everything. And we want our visitors to understand that certain landscape features and objects, including the materials from which they're made and the symbols that they hold, are considered the body or the living space of an ancestor, and that they activate connections between living and past peoples and the land. And this can be communicated in the exhibition through perhaps a drone video. Of this place here on the upper right-hand corner called Valley of the Gods. And we have these rock art features that are observed by the Navajo as being ancestral warriors whose deeds were so great that they were lithified or turned to stone so that they are here permanently in the land within Bears Ears. This embodiment can also be communicated perhaps by this shell pendant, the Zuni shell pendant, which perhaps holds the essence of the sea and the stories of people's migrations to the sea, and what that, and everything, all the details that are encoded in that. And also in the symbols, in which we can see here on our Navajo blanket in the lower right-hand corner. And this is an opportunity to tell the audience that this symbol is not a swastika. This is a symbol of the story of the swirling logs, which corresponds to the boy who taught himself, which actually is on the San Juan River on the border of Bears Ears National Monument. So this symbol embodies this story. Moving on to Gallery 4, we have sustenance, the idea that Bears Ears have provided spiritual and physical nourishment of thousands of years and continues to do so today. And this is where we get in this idea of indigeneity, of people being linked to the land through the food that they produce and the water that they're procuring. And this can be communicated through a kachina doll that we see here, which is a squash kachina doll, or iconography on this ancestral Hopi Jedito vessel that we have here with corn stalks on it, or corn stalks on this Navajo rock art panel, or means of fishing, like this Ute fishing trap that we have here. So there are dynamic ways that we can communicate these messages. Moving along, our next gallery focuses on trade or exchange or relationships, the exchange of ideas, objects and people and so forth. And the point that the Bears Ears was an important cog in an enormous trade network that extended from the Northwest coast all the way down to Mesoamerica. And this can hopefully be displayed and expressed and communicated through things like this macaw feather pelt, which was actually found in Bears Ears National Monument and resides today at Edge of the Cedars State Park in Utah, just outside of Bears Ears. If we were able to loan this, this would be a really, really good thing. So we'll see if that happens. These trade relationships can also be communicated through trades between tribes, like this Ute Chiefs blankets, which are actually made by the Navajo and were traded to Ute Chiefs, or also trade with other communities, foreign communities, with Westerners, like this Hopi Nampeo vessel, which was really produced in the early part of the 20th century for the Western tourist market. Coming up next, our penultimate gallery, Balance and Harmony. This comes into this concept of duality in Andean thought. We really want our audience to understand that maintaining balance internally, socially, environmentally, and with the ancestors is crucial to indigenous relations with the land and with time, and that the Bears Ears is integral to this. And so what we can communicate balance and harmony of it perhaps being destroyed when burial vessels like this one in the upper left-hand corner are taken out of the ground. Balance and harmony is destroyed when the ancestors and their belongings are taken out of the ground. Balance can also be communicated through iconography or symbols, like we can see in the pot in the lower left-hand corner here, or through ceremonial practice by bringing the Kachina water deities in from the San Francisco Mountains, which we can see here in our Kachina doll on the right-hand side. And just tying this up in our last gallery, union and conversation, this will be our final message that Bears Ears is a living land, that it unites past and present people, and that like other living lands across the globe, it is threatened, and its preservation and conservation is vitally important. So this can be communicated also through iconography, like in the lower right-hand corner, where we have these interlocking swirls. These refer to oftentimes of meeting places between people and so forth. Or a Navajo wedding basket in the upper right-hand corner here, this idea of union, of coming together of clans or families or people with the lands or so forth. And lastly, what we really want to do in this gallery is to have a collaborative artwork that's produced by artists from each of the tribes of the coalition that will be displayed in this gallery. It'll sort of be like the cherry on top, the end final message in the exhibition. And this is a photo of a Tlingit totem pole that was done by a father-son team at the Field Museum. So this is just an example of a collaborative effort of making and producing a work that will then be displayed in the gallery as well. So with that, finish up with just our programming initiatives. Like we did in the Andes, I want to make a traveling or satellite versions that are culturally specific for each tribe that will be housed and displayed at community centers and schools on tribal lands, again, to aid in the retention and transmission of traditional cultural knowledge. This will involve educational materials that will be distributed in schools. We also would like to have a symposium that might have more of an academic angle to it. Personally, I'd like that to result in an edited volume on the state of landscape research in the Americas. And lastly, we would like to have artist workshops as well involved in our programming strategies. So with that, I'll end this. Thank you all for this opportunity. If you have any questions, you can see my email at the bottom here, and I guess we can open it up for questions now.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Ambrosino, for an amazing presentation. It was really nice to see the development of your exhibition, because I know when we first spoke, it was more so organized by tribe, and this more thematic approach is much more wonderfully interconnected, I think. But yes, let's open the floor to questions. I think we're a small enough group that people can unmute and ask if they'd like, or if you feel more comfortable, you can also just type it into the chat.
I'll start if you don't mind. First of all, thank you for coming and giving us this wonderful sort of synthetic perspective on two, really substantial independent projects. And I'm very much looking forward, well, both to your book, but also to the exhibit. as that develops. And I echo what Emily said, that the thematic approach is, and the way that you've been able to thread this into the archaeological outcomes is really fascinating. And in thinking about the linkages of things and people, objects, and landscapes, and these themes and the whole mission of coming together around objects in a different place, and then maybe traveling. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about the actual sort of human aspect of this mobilization of objects from these landscapes, vis-a-vis the stakeholder meetings that you had, the way that you formulated the, I guess you showed us a chart, for example, and I was interested to understand, what were the different, how did those map out, and how is this exhibit proposal that you're developing now a response to that, to the different interests of the people who are gathered for the big meeting?
That's a great question, Len. And unfortunately, I can't entirely answer this right now, because that chart that I showed in the photo, that was produced in the last week of February. So if you recall, February 2020. So if you recall, that was 2 weeks before everything went pear-shaped with COVID. So things have been very much on hold since then. We've had meetings between the museums and with the coalition leaders, but not really with the cultural leaders from each tribe. So we haven't really had that opportunity yet to get at a nuanced or more granular level of how we're going to apply all of these objects into these narratives, or if even all of these narratives are going to be set as they are right now. Everything is very flexible. So we're looking forward to having these conversations that will deal with several issues, one of which, first, obviously, what can and can't we use? Okay, so there's a lot of burial items and culturally sensitive items in these collections. So we need permission from the tribes to display any of this, first of all. Fortunately, from the tribes, thus far, we've had a really positive response of displaying things like burial items, specifically in communicating messages about conservation and looting and so forth. So they've been very open and amenable to a wide range of object displays and other media displayed in the exhibition. And I hope, I anticipate that those conversations will continue on those trajectories going forward when we pick things back up, which looks to be soon. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does in part. And if I could just follow up in one, all of those different columns in the chart you showed us, I mean, it came through really quickly, but I was wondering, were there prompts that you gave to get each of those different responses, or how were you facilitating that? I'm kind of interested in both the process and the way that it laid a foundation for something that is clearly succeeding and developing.
Yeah, so the way those perhaps boxes were filled out, I was able to do some of that work on my own, just with my individual conversations with the cultural leaders. So with that, I was able to get a good idea of who wants what, who doesn't want what, how do they want it, how don't they want it. So I was able to, a certain degree, kind of fill those up. But when we were at the meeting table together, we were really able to flesh that out. And everyone from every tribe was really able to say, we want this, we don't want this, in very clear terms, which was really kind of a blessing, because oftentimes working with non-Western communities, people can be very shy about talking about these things for various reasons, often for sensitivity issues. So again, we were very fortunate and very lucky to have everyone to be very, very forthright and very open with their desires for the exhibition.
So it sounds like you did a lot of pre-meeting before the meeting as well.
2 years worth.
Right.
All right, and it seems we have a few questions in the chat. I'll just read them out to you. So the first one, seeing as these indigenous objects are so tied to the land as you have shown us, in a museum exhibition setting, how is that lack of landscape context replicated or addressed? I know you mentioned some VR. Could you go more into that topic?
Well, for example, we want to have a really dynamic presentation, right? So for example, we may have an object or a photo of a landscape feature or a VR or AR experience that will be complemented with a cultural leader describing what that is and explaining those connections and interrelations in their own cultural terms. It won't be me explaining it from an academic or outsider standpoint, but really them explaining how and why these connections exist and why they're important and how those things feed and inform their own identities with place.
Kind of hopping on to that, is there like a need for translation, or is it like an audio experience that has been recorded within the exhibition galleries, or how is that explanation working?
Those details need to be ironed out yet, but the way I envisioned it is that each didactic or tombstone will be in English and in indigenous language, and also in Spanish too. This gets tricky because things start becoming very text heavy. The good news is it's no longer in an art museum, and it's now in a natural history museum, which allows for more text and more deliberate explanation of things. So in an art museum, you may or may not know, Emily, I'm sure you do, you have your object and you let the visitor sort of make their own interpretations for themselves. So being in another type of museum, this really affords an opportunity to have more text on the walls at the end of the day.
All right, thank you. Moving on to the next. I am very pro-didactic, by the way, just my museum stance. The second question is, when you mentioned your excavation work previously, I think in the first part of your presentation, because that's often inherently a destructive process, what was the excavation like with landscape and rock art? And follow up, how does one begin to approach preserving rock art when it's tied to a kind of natural environment?
So the excavation, we were very fortunate to have our indigenous collaborators and participants in the excavation. So they were informing us on sensitivity issues on excavating and so forth. But this was really one of the more tricky things to communicate to the communities, is because you have this Westerner, North American, coming in from a foreign land that's proposing excavations, and people think like, oh, and people have said this to me directly, like, oh, he's looking for gold, he's trying to take things from us. And I was actually like, no, I'm actually looking for carbon samples. So in the rock shelters, for example, I focus the excavation units in the back corners of the shelters, where they had these soot stains on the walls that came down to a low point, and that's where I could tell where the fire pits were. So that's sort of functionally where I organize the excavation units. After that, with the materials, everything had to be processed and delivered to the local regional museum in Huaraz, Ancash, Peru.
Yeah, I was gonna ask earlier, but I think you really addressed it both with Lynn's question and this one, was that I feel like oftentimes NAGPRA and museum institutions and government institutions are framed as diametrically opposed to Native communities, like this versus. So that 2 years you had of like relationship building, I'm sure was really vital to this project.
It's the only reason the project was able to go. So I mean, for example, I didn't even start talking with the coalition until we were about 1.5 years in. And so their initial response was similar to what I encountered with the Andean communities. Who are you? What are you doing here? Why do you want to be part of this? Things of that nature. And the only reason the coalition accepted me in is because I had relationships with legitimate people from the tribes of the coalition. So they sussed that out, and they eventually said, all right, this guy seems okay. Let's work together. Not to speak for them, but in a nutshell.
Yeah, but I'm conscious of time, but just one more comment before we wrap up is that I think it's really interesting that you emphasize like the ancestral connection to these objects. Because I was just in a webinar where a curator refused to use the word object or artifact in general, and she just referred to them as indigenous ancestors, like within a museum collection, which I think is moving in the right direction and very culturally understanding, if you agree.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the preferred lexicon now, I suppose. Too, we don't use terms like human remains anymore. We refer to the ancestors in our collections and their belongings, not their objects and so forth. So yeah, there's a lot of sensitivity training still going on with museums, and we're all still learning still. And NAGPRA is a really good mechanism for facilitating these learning experiences and conversations.
All right, but I think that is the end of our speaker series as a whole, actually. But again, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank Dr. Gordon Ambrosino so much for speaking to us and sharing your work with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all for the invitation. It was a pleasure to spend our afternoon together, and I'll look forward to hopefully seeing you guys next time I'm in Los Angeles.
You
All right,
have an
thank you so
invitation.
much.
I hope you'll come and visit.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Dodd. Appreciate it.
All right, bye everyone.
Bye.